Chapter 15 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 15. Sir Everard Dominey, baronet, the latest and most popular recruit to Norfolk sporting society, stood one afternoon, some months after his return from Germany, at the corner of the long wood which stretched from the ridge of hills, and listening to the approach of the beaters. On the other, Seaman, curiously out of place in his dark grey suit and bowler hat. The old keeper, whom time seemed to have cured of all his apprehensions, was softly garrulous and very happy. "That do seem right to have a Squire Dominey at this corner," he observed, watching a high cock pheasant come crashing down over their heads. "I mind when the Squire, your father, sir, gave up this corner one day to Lord Wendermere, whom folks called one of the finest pheasant shots in England, and though they streamed over his head like starlings, he'd nowt but a few cripples to show for his morning's work." "Come out with a bit of a twist from the left, don't they?" Dominey remarked, repeating his late exploit. "They do that, sir," the old man assented, "and no one but a Dominey seems to have learnt the knack of dealing with them proper. That foreign prince, so they say, is well on to his birds, but I wouldn't trust him at this corner." The old man moved off a few paces to some higher ground, to watch the progress of the beaters through the wood. Seaman turned to his companion, and there was a note of genuine admiration in his tone. "My friend," he declared, "you are a miracle. You seem to have developed the Dominey touch even in killing pheasants." "You must remember that I have shot higher ones in Hungary," was the easy reply. "I am not a sportsman," Seaman admitted. "I do not understand sport, but I do know this. There is an old man who has lived on this land since the day of his birth, who has watched you shoot reverently, and finds even the way you hold your gun familiar." "That twist of the birds," Dominey explained, "is simply a local superstition. The woods end on the slant, and they seem to be flying more to the left than they really are." Seaman gazed steadfastly for a moment along the side of the wood. "Her Grace is coming," he said. "She seems to share the Duke's dislike of me, and she is too great a lady to conceal her feelings. Just one word before I go. The Princess Eiderstrom arrives this afternoon." Dominey frowned, then, warned by the keeper's shout, turned around and killed a hare. "My friend," he said, with a certain note of challenge in his tone, "I am not certain that you have told me all that you know concerning the Princess's visit." Seaman was thoughtful for a brief space of time. "You are right," he admitted. "I have not. It is a fault which I will repair presently." He strolled away to the next stand, where Mr. Mangan was displaying an altogether different standard of proficiency. The Duchess came up to Dominey a few minutes later. "I told Henry I shouldn't stop with him another moment," she declared. "He has fired off about 40 cartridges and wounded one hare." "Henry is not keen," Dominey remarked, "although I think you are a little hard on him, are you not? I saw him bring down a nice cock just now. So far as regards the birds, it really does not matter. They are all going home." The Duchess was very smartly tailored in clothes of brown leather mixture. She wore thick shoes and gaiters and a small hat. She was looking very well, but a little annoyed. "I hear," she said, "that Stephanie is coming to-day." Dominey nodded, and seemed for a moment intent on watching the flight of a pigeon which kept tantalizingly out of range. "She is coming down for a few days," he assented. "I am afraid that she will be bored to death." "Where did you become so friendly with her?" his cousin asked curiously. "The first time we ever met," Dominey replied, "was in the Carlton grill room, a few days after I landed in England. She mistook me for some one else, and we parted with the usual apologies. I met her the same night at Carlton House Terrace. She is related to the Terniloffs, and we came across one another pretty often after that, during the short time I was in town." "Yes," the Duchess murmured meditatively. "That is another of the little surprises you seem to have already dished up for us. How on earth did you become so friendly with the German ambassador?" Dominey smiled tolerantly. "Really," he replied, "there is not anything so very extraordinary about it, is there? Mr. Seaman, my partner in one or two mining enterprises, took me to call upon him. He is very interested in East Africa, politically and as a sportsman. Our conversations seemed to interest him and led to a certain intimacy, of which I may say that I am proud. I have the greatest respect and liking for the Prince." "So have I," Caroline agreed. "I think he's charming. Henry declares that he must be either a fool or a knave." "Henry is blinded by prejudice," Dominey declared a little impatiently. "He cannot imagine a German who feasts with any one else but the devil." "Don't get annoyed, dear," she begged, resting her fingers for a moment upon his coat sleeve. "I admire the Prince immensely. He is absolutely the only German I ever met whom one felt instinctively to be a gentleman. Now, what are you smiling at?" Dominey turned a perfectly serious face towards her. "Not guilty," he pleaded. "I saw you smile." "It was just a quaint thought. You are rather sweeping, are you not, Caroline?" "I'm generally right," she declared. "To return to the subject of Stephanie." "Well?" "Do you know whom she mistook you for in the Carlton grill room?" "Tell me," he answered evasively. "She mistook you for a Baron Leopold von Ragastein," Caroline continued dryly. "Von Ragastein was her lover in Hungary. He fought a duel with her husband and killed him. The Kaiser was furious and banished him to East Africa." Dominey picked up his shooting stick and handed his gun to Middleton. The beaters were through the wood. "Yes, I remember now," he said. "She addressed me as Leopold." "I still don't see why it was necessary to invite her here," his companion observed a little petulantly. "She may call you Leopold again." "If she does, I shall be deaf," Dominey promised. "But seriously, she is a cousin of the Princess Terniloff, and the two women are devoted to one another. The Princess hates shooting parties, so I thought they could entertain one another." "Bosh! Stephanie will monopolize you all the time. That's what she's coming for." "You are not suggesting that she intends seriously to put me in the place of my double?" Dominey asked, with mock alarm. "Oh, I shouldn't wonder. And she's an extraordinarily attractive woman. I'm full of complaints, Everard. There's that other horrible little man, Seaman. You know that the very sight of him makes Henry furious. I am quite sure that he never expected to sit down at the same table with him." "I am really sorry about that," Dominey assured her. "But you see, His Excellency takes a great interest in him on account of this Friendship League, of which Seaman is secretary, and he particularly asked to have him here." "Well, you must admit that the situation is a little awkward for Henry," she complained. "Next to Lord Roberts, Henry is practically the leader of the National Service movement here. He hates Germany and distrusts every German he ever met, and in a small house party like this we meet the German ambassador and a man who is working hard to lull to sleep the very sentiments which Henry is endeavouring to arouse." "It sounds very pathetic," Dominey admitted with a smile. "But even Henry likes Terniloff, and after all it is stimulating to meet one's opponents sometime." "Of course he likes Terniloff," Caroline assented, "but he hates the things he stands for. However, I'd have forgiven you everything if only Stephanie weren't coming. That woman is really beginning to irritate me. She always seems to be making mysterious references to some sentimental past in which you both are concerned, and for which there can be no foundation at all, except your supposed likeness to her exiled lover. Why, you never met her until that day at the Carlton." "She was a complete stranger to me," Dominey asserted. "Then all I can say is that you have been unusually rapid, if you've managed to create a past in something under 3 months," Caroline pronounced suspiciously. "I call her coming here a most barefaced proceeding, especially as this is practically a bachelor establishment." They had arrived at the next stand, and conversation was temporarily suspended. A flight of wild duck were put out from a pool in the wood, and for a few minutes every one was busy. Middleton watched his master with unabated approval. "You're most as good as the old squire with them high duck, Sir Everard," he said. That's true, very few can touch 'em when they're comin' out nigh to the pheasants. They can't believe in the speed of 'em." "Do you think Sir Everard shoots as well as he did before he went to Africa?" Caroline asked. Middleton touched his hat and turned to Seaman, who was standing in the background. "Better, your Grace," he answered, "as I was sayin' to this gentleman here early this mornin'. He's cooler like, and swings more level. I'd have known his touch on a gun anywhere, though." There was a glint of admiration in Seaman's eyes. The beaters came through the wood, and the little party of guns gossiped together while the game was collected. Terniloff, his usual pallor chased away by the bracing wind and the pleasure of the sport, was affable and even loquacious. He had great estates of his own in Saxony, and was explaining to the Duke his manner of shooting them. Middleton glanced at his horn-rimmed watch. "There's another hour's good light, sir," he said. "Would you care about a partridge drive, or should we do through the home copse?" "If I might make a suggestion," Terniloff observed diffidently. "Most of the pheasants went into that gloomy-looking wood just across the marshes." There was a moment's rather curious silence. Domini had turned and was looking towards the wood in question, as though fascinated by its almost sinister-like blackness and density. Middleton had dropped some game he was carrying and was muttering to himself. "We call that the Black Wood," Domini said calmly, "and I am rather afraid that the pheasants who find their way there claim sanctuary. What do you think, Middleton?" The old man turned his head slowly and looked at his master. Somehow or other, every scrap of colour seemed to have faded out of his bronzed face. His eyes were filled with that vague horror of the supernatural common amongst the peasant folk of various localities. His voice shook. The old fear was back again. "You wouldn't put the beaters in there, Squire," he faltered. "Not that there's one of them would go." "Have we stumbled up against a local superstition?" the Duke inquired. "That's not altogether local, your Grace," Middleton replied, "as the Squire himself will tell you. I doubt whether there's a beater in all Norfolk would go through the Black Wood, if you paid him red gold for it. Here, you lads." He turned to the beaters, who were standing waiting for instructions a few yards away. There were a dozen of them, stalwart men for the most part, clad in rough smocks and breeches, and carrying thick sticks. "There's one of the gentlemen here," Middleton announced, addressing them, "who wants to know if you'd go through the Black Wood of Domini for a sovereign apiece. Watch their faces, your Grace. Now then, lads." There was no possibility of any mistake. The very suggestion seemed to have taken the healthy sunburn from their cheeks. They fumbled with their sticks uneasily. One of them touched his hat and spoke to Domini. "I'm one as 'as seen it, sir, as well as heard," he said. "I'd sooner give up my farm than go nigh the place." Caroline suddenly passed her arm through Domini's. There was a note of distress in her tone. "Henry, you're an idiot!" she exclaimed. "It was my fault, Everard. I'm so sorry. Just for one moment I had forgotten. I ought to have stopped Henry at once. The poor man has no memory." Domini's arm responded for a moment to the pressure of her fingers. Then he turned to the beaters. "Well, no one is going to ask you to go to the Black Wood," he promised. "Get round to the back of Hunt's stubbles, and bring them into the roots and then over into the park. We will line the park fence. How is that, Middleton?" The keeper touched his hat and stepped briskly off. "I'll just have a walk with them myself, sir," he said. "Them birds do break at Fuller's Corner. I'll see if I can flank them. You'll know where to put the guns, Squire." Domini nodded. One and all, the beaters were walking with most unaccustomed speed towards their destination. Their backs were towards the Black Wood. Terniloff came up to his host. "Have I, by chance, been terribly tactless?" he asked. Domini shook his head. "You asked a perfectly natural question, Prince," he replied. "There is no reason why you should not know the truth. Near that wood occurred the tragedy which drove me from England for so many years." "I am deeply grieved," the Prince began. "It is false sentiment to avoid allusions to it," Domini interrupted. "I was attacked there one night by a man who had some cause for offence against me. We fought, and I reached home in a somewhat alarming state. My condition terrified my wife so much that she has been an invalid ever since." But here is the point which has given birth to all these superstitions, and which made me for many years a suspected person. The man with whom I fought has never been seen since." Terniloff was at once too fascinated by the story and puzzled by his host's manner of telling it to maintain his apologetic attitude. "Never seen since?" he repeated. "My own memory as to the end of our fight is uncertain," Domini continued. "My impression is that I left my assailant unconscious upon the ground." "Then it is his ghost, I imagine, who haunts the Black Wood?" Domini shook himself as one who would get rid of an unwholesome thought. "The wood itself, Prince," he explained as they walked along, "is a noisome place. There are quagmires even in the middle of it, where a man may sink in and be never heard of again. Every sort of vermin abounds there, every unclean insect and bird are to be found in the thickets. I suppose the character of the place has encouraged the local superstition, in which every one of these men firmly believes." "They absolutely believe the place to be haunted, then?" "The superstition goes further," Domini continued. "Our locals say that somewhere in the heart of the wood, where I believe that no human being for many years has dared to penetrate, there is living in the spiritual sense some sort of a demon who comes out only at night and howls underneath my windows." "Has anyone ever seen it?" "One or two of the villagers, to the best of my belief. No one else," Domini replied. Terniloff seemed on the point of asking more questions, but the Duke touched him on the arm and drew him to one side, as though to call his attention to the sea fogs which were rolling up from the marshes. "Prince," he whispered, "the details of that story are inextricably mixed up with the insanity of Lady Dominey. I am sure you understand." The Prince, a diplomatist to his fingertips, appeared shocked, although a furtive smile still lingered upon his lips. "I regret my faux pas most deeply," he murmured. "Sir Everard," he went on, "you promised to tell me about some of your days with a shotgun in South Africa. Isn't there a bird there which corresponds with your partridges?" Domini smiled. "If you can kill the partridges which Middleton is going to send over in the next 10 minutes," he said, "you could shoot anything of the sort that comes along in East Africa with a catapult. If you will just stand a few paces there to the left, Henry, Terniloff by the gate, Stillwell up by the left-hand corner, Mangan next, Eddy next, and I shall be just beyond towards the oak clump. Will you walk with me, Caroline?" His cousin took his arm as they walked off and pressed it. "Everard, I congratulate you," she said. "You have conquered your nerve absolutely. You did a simple and a fine thing to tell the whole story. Why, you were almost matter-of-fact. I could even have imagined you were telling it about someone else." Her host smiled enigmatically. "Curious that it should have struck you like that," he remarked. "Do you know, when I was telling it, I had the same feeling. Do you mind crouching down a little now? I am going to blow the whistle." End of chapter 15. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 16 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 16. Even in the great dining-room of Domini Hall, the mahogany table which was its great glory was stretched that evening to its extreme capacity. Besides the house party, which included the Right Honourable Gerald Watson, a recently appointed Cabinet Minister, there were several guests from the neighbourhood, the Lord Lieutenant of the county and other notabilities. Caroline, with the Lord Lieutenant on one side of her, and Terniloff on the other, played the part of hostess adequately, but without enthusiasm. Her eyes seldom left for long the other end of the table, where Stephanie, at Domini's left hand, with her crown of exquisitely coiffured red gold hair, her marvellous jewellery, her languorous grace of manner, seemed more like one of the beauties of an ancient Venetian court than a modern Hungarian princess gowned in the Rue de la Paix. Conversation remained chiefly local and concerned the day's sport and kindred topics. It was not until towards the close of the meal that the Duke succeeded in launching his favourite bubble. "I trust, Everard," he said, raising his voice a little as he turned towards his host, "that you make a point of inculcating the principles of national service into your tenantry here." Dominey's reply was a little dubious. "I am afraid they do not take to the idea very kindly in this part of the world," he confessed. "Purely agricultural districts are always a little difficult." "It is your duty as a landowner," the Duke insisted, "to alter their point of view. There is not the slightest doubt," he added, looking belligerently over the top of his pince nez at Seaman, who was seated at the opposite side of the table, "that before long we shall find ourselves, and in a shocking state of unpreparedness, mind you, at war with Germany." Lady Maddeley, the wife of the Lord Lieutenant, who sat at his side, seemed a little startled. She was probably one of the only people present who was not aware of the Duke's foible. "Do you really think so?" she asked. "The Germans seem such civilised people, so peaceful and domestic in their home life, and that sort of thing." The Duke groaned. He glanced down the table to be sure that Prince Terniloff was out of hearing. "My dear Lady Maddeley," he declared, "Germany is not governed like England. When the war comes, the people will have had nothing to do with it. A great many of them will be just as surprised as you will be, but they will fight all the same." Seaman, who had kept silence during the last few moments with great difficulty, now took up the Duke's challenge. "Permit me to assure you, madam," he said, bowing across the table, "that the war with Germany of which the Duke is so afraid will never come. I speak with some amount of knowledge because I am a German by birth, although naturalised in this country. I have as many and as dear friends in Berlin as in London, and with the exception of my recent absence in Africa, where I had the pleasure to meet our host, I spent a great part of my time going back and forth between the two capitals. I have also the honour to be the secretary of a society for the promotion of a better understanding between the citizens of Germany and England." "Rubbish!" the Duke exclaimed. "The Germans don't want a better understanding. They only want to fool us into believing they do." Seaman looked a little pained. He stuck to his guns, however. "His Grace and I," he observed, "are old opponents on this subject." "We are indeed," the Duke agreed. "You may be an honest man, Mr. Seaman, but you are a very ignorant one upon this particular topic." "You are both probably right in your way," Dominey intervened, very much in the manner of a well-bred host making his usual effort to smooth over two widely divergent points of view. "There is no doubt a war party in Germany, and a peace party, statesmen who place economic progress first, and others who are tainted with a purely military lust for conquest. In this country it is very hard for us to strike a balance between the two." Seaman beamed his thanks upon his host. "I have friends," he said impressively, "in the very highest circles of Germany, who are continually encouraging my work here, and I have received the benediction of the Kaiser himself upon my efforts to promote a better feeling in this country. And if you will forgive my saying so, Duke, it is such ill-advised and ill-founded statements as you are constantly making about my country which is the only bar to a better understanding between us." "I have my views," the Duke snapped, "and they have become convictions. I shall continue to express them at all times and with all the eloquence at my command." The Ambassador, to whom portions of this conversation had now become audible, leaned a little forward in his place. "Let me speak first as a private individual," he begged, "and express my well-studied opinion that war between our two countries would be simply race suicide, an indescribable and an abominable crime. Then I will remember what I represent over here, and I will venture to add in my ambassadorial capacity that I come with an absolute and heartfelt mandate of peace. My task over here is to secure and ensure it." Caroline flashed a warning glance at her husband. "How nice of you to be so frank, Prince," she said. "The Duke sometimes forgets in the pursuit of his hobby that a private dinner table is not a platform. I insist upon it that we discuss something of more genuine interest." "There isn't a more vital subject in the world," the Duke declared, resigning himself, however, to silence. "We will speak," the Ambassador suggested, "of the way in which our host brought down those tall pheasants." "You will tell me, perhaps," Seaman suggested to the lady to his right, "how you Englishwomen have been able to secure for yourselves so much more liberty than our German wives enjoy." "Later on," Stephanie whispered to her host, with a little tremble in her voice, "I have a surprise for you." After dinner, Dominey's guests passed naturally enough to the relaxations which each preferred. There were two bridge tables, Terniloff and the Cabinet Minister played billiards, and Seaman, with a touch which amazed every one, drew strange music from the yellow keys of the old-fashioned grand piano in the drawing-room. Stephanie and her host made a slow progress through the hall and picture gallery. For some time their conversation was engaged solely with the objects to which Dominey drew his companion's attention. When they had passed out of possible hearing, however, of any of the other guests, Stephanie's fingers tightened upon her companion's arm. "I wish to speak to you alone," she said, "without the possibility of any one overhearing." Dominey hesitated and looked behind. "Your guests are well occupied," she continued a little impatiently, "and in any case, I am one of them. I claim your attention." Dominey threw open the door of the library and turned on a couple of the electric lights. She made her way to the great open fireplace, on which a log was burning, looked down into the shadows of the room, and back again at her host's face. "For one moment," she begged, "turn on all the lights. I wish to be sure that we are alone." Dominey did as he was bidden. The furthermost corners of the room, with its many wings of book-filled shelves, were illuminated. She nodded. "Now, turn them all out again except this one," she directed, "and wheel me up an easy-chair. No, I choose this settee. Please seat yourself by my side." "Is this going to be serious?" he asked, with some slight disquietude. "Serious, but wonderful," she murmured, lifting up her eyes to his. "Will you please listen to me, Leopold?" She was half curled up in a corner of the settee, her head resting slightly upon her long fingers, her brown eyes steadily fixed upon her companion. There was an atmosphere about her of serious yet of tender things. Dominey's face seemed to fall into more rigid lines as he realized the appeal of her eyes. "Leopold," she began, "I left this country a few weeks ago, feeling that you were a brute, determined never to see you again, half inclined to expose you before I went as an impostor and a charlatan. Germany means little to me, and a patriotism which took no account of human obligations left me absolutely unresponsive. I meant to go home and never to return to London. My heart was bruised and I was very unhappy." She paused, but her companion made no sign. She paused for so long, however, that speech became necessary. "You are speaking, Princess," he said calmly, "to one who is not present. My name is no longer Leopold." She laughed at him with a curious mixture of tenderness and bitterness. "My friend," she continued, "I am terrified to think, besides your name, how much of humanity you have lost in your new identity. To proceed it suited my convenience to remain for a few days in Berlin, and I was therefore compelled to present myself at Potsdam. There I received a great surprise. Wilhelm spoke to me of you, and though, alas, my heart is still bruised, he helped me to understand." "Is this wise?" he asked a little desperately. She ignored his words. "I was taken back into favour at court," she went on. "For that I owe to you my thanks. Wilhelm was much impressed by your recent visit to him, and by the way in which you have established yourself here. He spoke also with warm commendation of your labours in Africa, which he seemed to appreciate all the more as you were sent there an exile. He asked me, Leopold," she added, dropping her voice a little bit, "if my feelings towards you remained unchanged." Dominey's face remained unrelaxed. Persistently he refused the challenge of her eyes. "I told him the truth," she proceeded. "I told him
how it all began, and how it must last with me to the end. We spoke even of the duel. I told him what both your seconds had explained to me, that turn of the wrist, Conrad's wild lunge, how he literally threw himself upon the point of your sword. Wilhelm understands and forgives, and he has sent you this letter." She drew a small grey envelope from her pocket. On the seal were the imperial Hohenzollern arms. She passed it to him. "Leopold," she whispered, "please read that." He shook his head, although he accepted the letter with reluctant fingers. "Read the superscription," she directed. He obeyed her. It was addressed in a strange, straggling handwriting to Sir Everard Dominey, baronet. He broke the seal unwillingly and drew out the letter. It was dated barely a fortnight back. There was neither beginning nor ending, just a couple of sentences scrawled across the thick note paper. "It is my will that you offer your hand in marriage to the Princess Stephanie of Eiderstrom. Your union shall be blessed by the Church and approved by my court. Wilhelm." Dominey sat as a man enthralled with silence. She watched him. "Not on your knees yet?" she asked, with faint but somewhat resentful irony. "Can it be, Leopold, that you have lost your love for me? You have changed so much and in so many ways. Has the love gone?" Even to himself his voice sounded harsh and unnatural, his words instinct with the graceless cruelty of a clown. "This is not practical," he declared. "Think! I am, as I have been addressed here, and as I must remain yet for months to come, Everard Dominey, an Englishman and the owner of this house, the husband of Lady Dominey." "Where is your reputed wife?" Stephanie demanded, frowning. "In the nursing home where she has been for the last few months," he replied. "She has already practically recovered. She cannot remain there much longer." "You must insist upon it that she does." "I ask you to consider the suspicions which would be excited by such a course," Dominey pleaded earnestly. "And further, can you explain to me in what way I, having already, according to belief of everybody, another wife living, can take advantage of this mandate?" She looked at him wonderingly. "You make difficulties? You sit there like the cold Englishman whose place you are taking, you, whose tears have fallen before now upon my hand, whose lips—" "You speak of one who is dead," Dominey interrupted. "Dead until the coming of great events may bring him to life again. Until that time your lover must be dumb." Then her anger blazed out. She spoke incoherently, passionately, dragged his face down to hers, and clenched her fist the next moment as though she would have struck it. She broke down with a storm of tears. "Not so hard, not so hard, Leopold," she implored. "Oh, yours is a great task, and you must carry it through to the end. But we have his permission. There can be found a way. We could be married secretly. At least your lips, your arms. My heart is starved, Leopold." He rose to his feet. Her arms were still twined about his neck, her lips hungry for his kisses, her eyes shining up to his. "Have pity on me, Stephanie," he begged. "Until our time has come, there is dishonour even in a single kiss. Wait for the day you know of." She unwound her arms and shivered slightly. Her hurt eyes regarded him wonderingly. "Leopold," she faltered, "what has changed you like this? What has dried up all the passion in you? You are a different man. Let me look at you." She caught him by the shoulders, dragged him underneath the electric globe, and stood there gazing into his face. The great log upon the hearth was spluttering and fizzing. Through the closed door came the faint wave of conversation and laughter from outside. Her breathing was uneven, her eyes were seeking to rend the mask from his face. "Can you have learnt to care for any one else?" she muttered. "There were no women in Africa. This Rosamund Dominey, your reputed wife, they tell me that she is beautiful, that you have been kindness itself to her, that her health has improved since your coming, that she adores you. You wouldn't dare—" "No," he interrupted, "I should not dare. "Then what are you looking at?" she demanded. "Tell me that." Her eyes were following the shadowed picture which had passed out of the room. She saw once more the slight girlish form, the love-seeking light in those pleading dark eyes, the tremulous lips, the whole sweet appeal for safety from a frightened child to him, the strong man. He felt the clinging touch of those soft fingers laid upon his, the sweetness of those marvellously awakened emotions, so cruelly and drearily stifled through a cycle of years. The woman's passion by his side seemed suddenly tawdry and unreal, the seeking of her lips for his something horrible. His back was towards the door, and it was her cry of angry dismay which first apprised him of a welcome intruder. He swung around to find Seaman standing upon the threshold. Seaman, to him a very angel of deliverance. "I am indeed sorry to intrude, Sir Everard," the newcomer declared, with a shade of genuine concern on his round, good-humoured face. "Something has happened which I thought you ought to know at once. Can you spare me a moment?" The Princess swept past them without a word of farewell or a backward glance. She had the carriage and the air of an insulted queen. A shade of deeper trouble came into Seaman's face as he stepped respectfully to one side. "What is it that has happened?" Domini demanded. "Lady Domini has returned," was the quiet reply. End of chapter 16. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 17 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 17. It seemed to Domini that he had never seen anything more pathetic than that eager glance, half of hope, half of apprehension, flashed upon him from the strange, tired eyes of the woman who was standing before the log fire in a little recess of the main hall. By her side stood a pleasant, friendly-looking person in the uniform of a nurse. A yard or two behind, a maid carrying a jewel case. Rosamund, who had thrown back her veil, had been standing with her foot upon the fender. Her whole expression changed as Domini came hastily towards her with outstretched hands. "My dear child," he exclaimed, "welcome home!" "Welcome?" she repeated, with a glad catch in her throat. "You mean it?" With a self-control of which he gave no sign, he touched the lips which were raised so eagerly to his, as tenderly and reverently as though this were some strange child committed to his care. "Of course I mean it," he answered heartily. "But what possessed you to come without giving us notice? How was this nurse?" "Her ladyship has had no sleep for 2 nights," the latter replied. "She has been so much better that we dreaded the thought of a relapse, so Mrs. Coulson, our matron, thought it best to let her have her own way about coming. Instead of telegraphing to you, unfortunately, we telegraphed to Dr. Harrison, and I believe he is away." "Is it very wrong of me?" Rosamund asked, clinging to Domini's arm. "I had a sudden feeling that I must get back here. I wanted to see you again. Every one has been so sweet and kind at Falmouth, especially Nurse Alice here, but they weren't quite the same thing. You are not angry? These people who are staying here will not mind?" "Of course not," he assured her cheerfully. "They will be your guests. Tomorrow you must make friends with them all." "There was a very beautiful woman," she said timidly, "with red hair, who passed by just now. She looked very angry. That was not because I have come?" "Why should it be?" he answered. "You have a right here, a better right than any one." She drew a long sigh of contentment. "Oh, but this is wonderful!" she cried. "And you, dear, I shall call you Everard, mayn't I? You look just as I hoped you might. Will you take me upstairs, please? Nurse, you can follow us." She leaned heavily on his arm and even loitered on the way, but her steps grew lighter as they approached her own apartment. Finally, as they reached the corridor, she broke away from him and tripped on with the gaiety almost of a child to the door of her room. Then came a little cry of disappointment as she flung open the door. Several maids were there, busy with the refractory fire, and removing the covers from the furniture. But the room was half full of smoke, and entirely unprepared. "Oh, how miserable!" she exclaimed. "Everard, what shall I do?" He threw open the door of his own apartment. A bright fire was burning in the grate. The room was warm and comfortable. She threw herself with a little cry of delight into the huge Chesterfield drawn up to the edge of the hearthrug. "I can stay here, Everard, can't I, until you come up to bed?" she pleaded. "And then you can sit and talk to me, and tell me who is here, and all about the people. You have no idea how much better I am. All my music has come back to me, and they say that I play bridge ever so well. I shall love to help you entertain." The maid was slowly unfastening her mistress's boots. Rosamund held up her foot for him to feel. "See how cold I am," she complained. "Please rub it. I am going to have some supper up here with nurse. Will one of you maids please go down and see about it? What a lot of nice things you have, Everard," she added, looking around. "And that picture of me from the drawing-room on the table!" she cried, her eyes suddenly soft with joy. "You dear thing! What made you bring that up?" "I wanted to have it here," he told her. "I'm not so nice as that now," she sighed, a little wistfully. "Do not believe it," he answered. "You have not changed in the least. You will be better looking still when you have been here for a few months." She looked at him almost shyly, tenderly, yet still with that gleam of aloofness in her eyes. "I think," she murmured, "I shall be just what you want me to be. I think you could make me just what you want. Be very kind to me, please," she begged, stretching her arms out to him. "I suppose it is because I have been ill so long, but I feel so helpless. And I love your strength, and I want you to take care of me. Your own hands are quite cold," she added anxiously. "You look pale, too. You're not ill, Everard?" "I am very well," he assured her, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Forgive me now, won't you, if I hurry away? There are guests here, rather important guests. Tomorrow you must come and see them all." "And help you?" "And help me." Domini made his escape and went reeling down the corridor. At the top of the great quadrangular landing, he stopped and stood with half-closed eyes for several moments. From downstairs he could hear the sound of pleasantly raised voices, the music of a piano in the distance, the click of billiard balls. He waited until he had regained his self-possession. Then, as he was on the point of descending, he saw Seaman mounting the stairs. At a gesture he waited for him, waited until he came, and, taking him by the arm, led him to a great settee in a dark corner. Seaman had lost his usual blitheness. The good-humoured smile played no longer about his lips. "Where is Lady Dominey?" he asked. "In my room, waiting until her own is prepared." Seaman's manner was unusually grave. "My friend," he said, "you know very well that when we walk in the great paths of life, I am unscrupulous. In those other hours, alas, I have a weakness. I love women." "Well?" Dominey muttered. "I will admit," the other continued, "that you are placed in a delicate and trying position. Lady Dominey seems disposed to offer to you the affection which, notwithstanding their troubles together, she doubtless felt for her husband. I risk your anger, my friend, but I warn you to be very careful how you encourage her." A light flashed in Dominey's eyes. For the moment, angry words seemed to tremble upon his lips. Seaman's manner, however, was very gentle. He courted no offence. "If you were to take advantage of your position with any other, I would shrug my shoulders and stand on one side. But this mad Englishman's wife, or rather his widow, has been mentally ill. She is still weak-minded, just as she is tender-hearted. I watched her as she passed through the hall with you just now. She turns to you for love as a flower to the sun after a long spell of cold, wet weather. Von Ragastein, you are a man of honour. You must find means to deal with this situation, however difficult it may become." Dominey had recovered from his first wave of weakness.
His companion's words excited no sentiment of anger. He was conscious even of regarding him with a greater feeling of kindness than ever before. "My friend," he said, "you have shown me that you are conscious of one dilemma in which I find myself placed, and which I confess is exercising me to the utmost. Let me now advise you of another. The Princess Eiderstrom has brought to me an autograph letter from the Kaiser, commanding me to marry her." The situation, Seaman declared grimly, but for its serious side, would provide all the elements for a Palais Royal farce. For the present, however, you have duties below. I have said the words which were thumping against the walls of my heart. Their descent was opportune. Some of the local guests were preparing to make their departure, and Domini was in time to receive their adieux. They all left messages for Lady Domini, spoke of a speedy visit to her, and expressed themselves as delighted to hear of her return and recovery. As the last car rolled away, Caroline took her host's arm and led him to a chimney seat by the huge log fire in the inner hall. "My dear Everard," she said, "you really are a very terrible person." "Exactly why?" he demanded. "Your devotion to my sex," she continued, "is flattering, but far too catholic. Your return to England appears to have done what we understood to be impossible, restored your wife's reason. A fiery-headed Hungarian princess has pursued you down here, and has now gone to her room in a tantrum because you left her side for a few minutes to welcome your wife. And there remains our own sentimental little flirtation, a broken and, alas, a discarded thing. There is no doubt whatever, Everard, that you are a very bad lot." "You are distressing me terribly," Domini confessed. "But all the same, after a somewhat agitated evening, I must admit that I find it pleasant to talk with someone who is not wielding the lightnings. May I have a whisky and soda?" "Bring me one too, please," Caroline begged. "I fear that it will seriously impair the note which I had intended to strike in our conversation, but I am thirsty. And a handful of those Turkish cigarettes, too. You can devote yourself to me with a perfectly clear conscience. Your most distinguished guest has found a task after his own heart. He has got Henry in a corner of the billiard room, and is trying to convince him of what I am sure the dear man really believes himself, that Germany's intentions towards England are of a particularly dove-like nature. Your right honourable guest has gone to bed, and Eddie Pelham is playing billiards with Mr. Mangan. Every one is happy. You can devote yourself to soothing my wounded vanity, to say nothing of my broken heart." "Always gibing at me," Domini grumbled. "Not always," she answered quietly, raising her eyes for a moment. "There was a time, Everard, before that terrible tragedy, the last time you stayed at Dunratter, when I didn't jibe." "When, on the contrary, you were sweetness itself," he reflected. She sighed reminiscently. "That was a wonderful month," she murmured. "I think it was then, for the first time, that I saw traces of something in you which I suppose accounts for your being what you are to-day." "You think that I have changed, then?" She looked him in the eyes. "I sometimes find it difficult to believe," she admitted, "that you are the same man." He turned away to reach for his whisky and soda. "As a matter of curiosity," he asked, "why?" "To begin with, then," she commented, "you have become an almost precision in your speech. You used to be rather slangy at times." "What else?" "You used always to clip your final G's." "Shocking habit," he murmured. "I cured myself of that by reading aloud in the bush. Go on, please." "You carry yourself so much more stiffly. Sometimes you have the air of being surprised that you are not in uniform." "Trifles, all these things," he declared. "Now for something serious." "The serious things are pretty good," she admitted. "You used to drink whiskies and sodas at all hours of the day, and quite as much wine as was good for you at dinner time. Now, although you are a wonderful host, you scarcely take anything yourself." "You should see me at the port," he told her.
when you ladies are well out of the way. Some more of the good, please." "All your qualities seem to have come to the surface," she went on, "and I think that the way you have come back and faced it all is simply wonderful. Tell me, if that man's body should be discovered after all these years, would you be charged with manslaughter?" He shook his head. "I do not think so, Caroline." "Everard?" "Well?" "Did you kill Roger Unthank?" A portion of the burning log fell on to the hearth. Then there was a silence. They heard the click of the billiard balls in the adjoining room. Domini leaned forward, and with a pair of small tongs replaced the burning wood upon the fire. Suddenly he felt his hands clasped by his companion's. "Everard, dear," she said, "I am so sorry. You came to me a little tired tonight, didn't you? I think that you needed sympathy, and here I am asking you once more that horrible question. Forget it, please. Talk to me like your dear old self. Tell me about Rosamund's return. Is she really recovered, do you think?" "I saw her only for a few minutes," Domini replied, "but she seemed to me absolutely better. I must say that the weekly reports I have received from the nursing home quite prepared me for a great improvement. She is very frail, and her eyes still have that restless look, but she talks quite coherently." "What about that horrible woman?" "I have pensioned Mrs. Unthank. To my surprise I hear that she is still living in the village." "And your ghost?" "Not a single howl all the time that Rosamund has been away." "There is one thing more," Caroline began hesitatingly. That one thing lacked forever the clothing of words. There came a curious, almost a dramatic interruption. Through the silence of the hall there pealed the summons of the great bell which hung over the front door. Domini glanced at the clock in amazement. "Midnight!" he exclaimed. "Who on earth can be coming here at this time of night?" Instinctively they both rose to their feet. A manservant had turned the great key, drawn the bolts, and opened the door with difficulty. Little flakes of snow and a gust of icy wind swept into the hall, and following them the figure of a man, white from head to foot, his hair tossed with the wind, almost unrecognizable after his struggle. "Why, Dr. Harrison!" Domini cried, taking a quick step forward. "What brings you here at this time of night?" The doctor leaned upon his stick for a moment. He was out of breath, and the melting snow was pouring from his clothes on to the oak floor. They relieved him of his coat and dragged him towards the fire. "I must apologize for disturbing you at such an hour," he said as he took the tumbler which Domini pressed into his hand. "I have only just received Lady Dominey's telegram. I had to see you at once." Chapter 17. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 18 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 18. The doctor, with his usual bluntness, did not hesitate to make it known that this unusual visit was of a private nature. Caroline promptly withdrew, and the two men were left alone in the great hall. The lights in the billiard room and drawing room were extinguished. Every one in the house, except a few servants, had retired. "Sir Everard," the doctor began, "this return of Lady Dominey's has taken me altogether by surprise. I had intended tomorrow morning to discuss the situation with you." "I am most anxious to hear your report," Domini said. "My report is good," was the confident answer, "although I would not have allowed her to have left the nursing home so suddenly had I known there was nothing to keep her there. Lady Dominey, except for one hallucination, is in perfect health, mentally and physically." "And this one hallucination?" "That you are not her husband." Domini was silent for a moment. Then he laughed a little unnaturally. "Can a person be perfectly sane," he asked,
and yet be subject to an hallucination which must make the whole of her surroundings seem unreal?" "Lady Dominey is perfectly sane," the doctor answered bluntly. "And as for that hallucination, it is up to you to dispel it." "Perhaps you can give me some advice," Dominey suggested. "I can, and I am going to be perfectly frank with you," the doctor replied. "To begin with, then, there are certain obvious changes in you which might well minister to Lady Dominey's hallucination. For instance, you have been in England now some 8 months, during which time you have revealed an entirely new personality. You seem to have got rid of every one of your bad habits. You drink moderately, as a gentleman should. You have subdued your violent temper, and you have collected around you, where your personality could be the only inducement, friends of distinction and interest. This is not at all what one expected from the Everard Dominey who scuttled out of England a dozen years ago." "You are excusing my wife," Dominey remarked. "She needs no excuses," was the brusque reply. "She has been a long-enduring and faithful woman, suffering from a cruel illness brought on, to take the kindest view of it, through your clumsiness and lack of discretion. Like all good women, forgiveness is second nature to her. It has now become her wish to take her proper place in life." "But if her hallucination continues," Dominey asked, "if she seriously doubts that I am indeed her husband, how can she do that?" "That is the problem you and I have to face," the doctor said sternly. "The fact that your wife has been willing to return here to you while still subject to that hallucination is a view of the matter which I can neither discuss nor understand. I am here tonight, though, to lay a charge upon you. You have to remember that your wife needs still one step towards a perfect recovery, and until that step has been surmounted, you have a very difficult but imperative task." Dominey set his teeth for a moment. He felt the doctor's keen grey eyes glowing from under his shaggy eyebrows as he leaned forward, his hands upon his knees. "You mean," Dominey suggested quietly, "that until that hallucination has passed, we must remain upon the same terms as we have done since my arrival home?" "You've got it," the doctor assented. "It's a tangled up position, but we've got to deal with it, or rather, you have. I can assure you," he went on, "that all her other delusions have gone. She speaks of the ghost of Roger Unthank, of the cries in the night, of his mysterious death as parts of a painful past. She is quite conscious of her several attempts upon your life, and bitterly regrets them. Now we come to the real danger. She appears to be possessed of a passionate devotion towards you, whilst still believing that you are not her husband." Dominey pushed his chair back from the fire as though he felt the heat. His eyes seemed glued upon the doctor's. "I do not pretend," the latter continued gravely, "to account for that, but it is my duty to warn you, Sir Everard, that the devotion may lead her to great lengths. Lady Dominey is naturally of an exceedingly affectionate disposition, and this return to a stronger condition of physical health and a fuller share of human feelings has probably reawakened all those tendencies which her growing fondness for you and your position as her reputed husband make perfectly natural. I warn you, Sir Everard, that you may find your position an exceedingly difficult one. But, difficult though it may be, there is a plain duty before you. Keep and encourage your wife's affection, if you can. But let it be a charge upon you that whilst the hallucination remains, that affection must never pass certain bounds. Lady Dominey is a good and sweet woman. If she woke up one morning with that hallucination still in her mind, and any sense of guilt on her conscience, all our labours for these last months might well be wasted, and she herself might very possibly end her days in a madhouse." "Doctor," Dominey said firmly, "I appreciate every word you say. You can rely upon me." The doctor looked at him. "I believe I can," he admitted with a sigh of relief. "I am glad of it." "There is just one more phase of the position," Dominey went on, after a pause. "Supposing this hallucination of hers should pass.
supposing she should suddenly become convinced that I am her husband?" "In that case," the doctor replied earnestly, "the position would be exactly reversed, and it would be just as important for you not to check the affection which she might offer to you as it would be in the other case for you not to accept it. The moment she realizes, with her present predispositions, that you really are her lawful husband, that moment will be the beginning of a new life for her." Somehow they both seemed to feel that the last words had been spoken. After a brief pause, the doctor helped himself to a farewell drink, filled his pipe, and stood up. The car which Domini had ordered from the garage was already standing at the door. It was curious how both of them seemed disinclined to refer again, even indirectly, to the subject which they had been discussing. "Very good of you to send me back," the doctor said gruffly. "I started out all right, but it was a drear walk across the marshes." "I am very grateful to you for coming," Domini replied, with obvious sincerity. "You will come and have a look at the patient in a day or two?" "I'll stroll across as soon as you've got rid of some of this houseful," the doctor promised. "Good night." The two men parted, and curiously enough Domini was conscious that with those few awkward words of farewell some part of the incipient antagonism between them had been buried. Left to himself, he wandered for some moments up and down the great dimly lit hall. A strange restlessness seemed to have fastened itself upon him. He stood for a time by the dying fire, watching the grey ashes, stirred uneasily by the wind which howled down the chimney. Then he strolled to a different part of the hall, and one by one he turned on, by means of the electric switches, the newly installed lights which hung above the sombre oil pictures upon the wall. He looked into the faces of some of these dead Dominis, trying to recall what he had heard of their history, and dwelling longest upon a gallant of the Stuart epoch, whose misdeeds had supplied material for every intimate chronicler of those days. When at last the sight of a sleepy manservant hovering in the background forced his steps upwards, he still lingered for a few moments in the corridor and turned the handle of his bedroom door with almost reluctant fingers. His heart gave a great jump as he realized that there was someone there. He stood for a moment upon the threshold. Then he laughed shortly to himself at his foolish imagining. It was his servant, who was patiently awaiting his arrival. "You can go to bed, Dickens," he directed. "I shall not want you again tonight. We shoot in the morning." The man silently took his leave, and Domini commenced his preparations for bed. He was in no humour for sleep, however, and, still attired in his shirt and trousers, he wrapped a dressing gown around him, drew a reading lamp to his side, and threw himself into an easy-chair, a book in his hand. It was some time before he realized that the volume was upside down, and even when he had righted it, the words he saw had no meaning for him. All the time a queer procession of women's faces was passing before his eyes. Caroline, with her half-flirtatious, wholly sentimental bonne camaraderie; Stephanie, with her voluptuous figure and passion-lit eyes; and then, blotting the others utterly out of his thoughts and memory, Rosamund, with all the sweetness of life shining out of her eager face. He saw her as she had come to him last, with that little unspoken cry upon her tremulous lips, and the haunting appeal in her soft eyes. All other memories faded away. They were as though they had never been. Those dreary years of exile in Africa, the day-by-day tension of his precarious life, were absolutely forgotten. His heart was calling all the time for an unknown boon. He felt himself enmeshed in a world of cobwebs, a weakness more potent than all his boasted strength. Then he suddenly felt that the madness which he had begun to fear had really come. It was the thing for which he longed yet dreaded most. The faint click, the soft withdrawal of the panel, actually pushed back by a pair of white hands. Rosamund herself was there. Her eyes shone at him, mystically, wonderfully. Her lips were parted in a delightful smile, a smile in which there was a spice of girlish mischief. She turned for a moment to close the panel, then she came towards him with her finger upraised. "I cannot sleep," she said softly. "Do you mind my coming for a few minutes?" "Of course not," he answered. "Come and sit down." She curled up in his easy chair. "Just for a moment," she murmured contentedly. "Give me your hands, dear. But how cold! You must come nearer to the fire yourself." He sat on the arm of her chair, and she stroked his head with her hands. "You were not afraid, then?" she asked, "when you saw me come through the panel?" "I should never be afraid of any harm that you might bring me, dear," he assured her. "Because all that foolishness is really gone," she continued eagerly. "I know that whatever happened to poor Roger, it was not you who killed him. Even if I heard his ghost calling again tonight, I should have no fear. I can't think why I ever wanted to hurt you, Everard. I am sure that I always loved you." His arm went very softly around her. She responded to his embrace without hesitation. Her cheek rested upon his shoulder. He felt the warmth of her arm through her white, fur-lined dressing gown. "Why do you doubt any longer, then," he asked hoarsely, "that I am your husband?" She sighed. "Ah, but I know you are not," she answered. "Is it wrong of me to feel what I do for you, I wonder? You are so like, yet so unlike him. He is dead. He died in Africa. Isn't it strange that I should know it? But I do." "But who am I, then?" he whispered. She looked at him pitifully. "I do not know," she confessed. "But you are kind to me, and when I feel you are near I am happy. It is because I wanted to see you that I would not stay any longer at the nursing home. That must mean that I am very fond of you." "You are not afraid," he asked, "to be here alone with me?" She put her other arm around his neck and drew his face down. "I am not afraid," she assured him. "I am happy. But, dear, what is the matter? A moment ago you were cold. Now your head is wet, your hands are burning. Are you not happy because I am here?" Her lips were seeking his. His own touched them for a moment. Then he kissed her on both cheeks. She made a little grimace. "I am afraid," she said, "that you are not really fond of me." "Can't you believe," he asked hoarsely, "that I am really Everard, your husband? Look at me. Can't you feel that you have loved me before?" She shook her head a little sadly. "No, you are not Everard," she sighed. "But," she added, her eyes lighting up, "you bring me love and happiness and life, and—" A few seconds before, Dominey felt from his soul that he would have welcomed an earthquake, a thunderbolt, the crumbling of the floor beneath his feet, to have been spared the torture of her sweet importunities. Yet nothing so horrible as this interruption which really came could ever have presented itself before his mind. Half in his arms, with her head thrown back, listening, he too, horrified, convulsed for a moment even with real physical fear, they heard the silence of the night broken by that one awful cry, the cry of a man's soul in torment, imprisoned in the jaws of a beast. They listened to it together until its echoes died away. Then what was, perhaps, the most astonishing thing of all, she nodded her head slowly, unperturbed, unterrified. "You see," she said, "I must go back. He will not let me stay here. He must think that you are Everard. It is only I who know that you are not." She slipped from the chair, kissed him, and walking quite firmly across the floor, touched the spring and passed through the panel. Even then she turned around and waved a little good-bye to him. There was no sign of fear in her face, only a little dumb disappointment. The panel glided to and shut out the vision of her. Dominey held his head like a man who fears madness. End of chapter 18. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 19 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 19. Dawn the next morning was heralded by only a thin line of red
parting the masses of black-grey snow clouds which still hung low down in the east. The wind had dropped, and there was something ghostly about the still twilight as Domini issued from the back regions and made his way through the untrodden snow round to the side of the house underneath Rosamund's window. A little exclamation broke from his lips as he stood there. From the terraced walks, down the steps, and straight across the park to the corner of the Black Wood were fresh tracks. The cry had been no fantasy. Somebody or something had passed from the Black Wood and back again to this spot in the night. Domini, curiously excited by his discovery, examined the footmarks eagerly, then followed them to the corner of the wood. Here and there they puzzled him. They were neither like human footsteps nor the track of any known animal. At the edge of the wood they seemed to vanish into the heart of a great mass of brambles, from which here and there the snow had been shaken off. There was no sign of any pathway. If ever there had been one, the neglect of years had obliterated it. Bracken, brambles, shrubs and bushes had grown up and degenerated, only to be succeeded by a ranker and more dense form of undergrowth. Many of the trees, although they were still plentiful, had been blown down and left to rot on the ground. The place was silent, except for the slow drip of falling snow from the drooping leaves. He took one more cautious step forward, and found himself slowly sinking. Black mud was oozing up through the snow where he had set his feet. He was just able to scramble back. Picking his way with great caution, he commenced a leisurely perambulation of the whole of the outside of the wood. Heggs, the junior keeper, an hour or so later, went over the gun rack once more, tapped the empty cases, and turned towards Middleton, who was sitting in a chair before the fire, smoking his pipe. "I can't find master's number 2 gun, Mr. Middleton," he announced. "That's missing." "Look again, lad," the old keeper directed, removing the pipe from his mouth. "The master was shooting with it yesterday. Look amongst those loose 'uns at the far end of the rack. It must be somewhere there." "Well, it isn't," the young man replied obstinately. The door of the room was suddenly opened, and Domini entered with the missing gun under his arm. Middleton rose to his feet at once and laid down his pipe. Surprise kept him temporarily silent. "I want you to come this way with me for a moment," his master ordered. The keeper took up his hat and stick and followed. Domini led him to where the tracks had halted on the gravel outside Rosamund's window, and pointed across to the Black Wood. "What do you make of those?" he inquired. Middleton did not hesitate. He shook his head gravely. "Was anything heard last night, sir?" "There was an infernal yell underneath this window." "That was the spirit of Roger Unthank for sure," Middleton pronounced with a little shudder. "When he do come out of that wood, he do call." "Spirits," his master pointed out, "do not leave tracks like that behind." Middleton considered the matter. "They do say hereabout," he confided, "that the spirit of Roger Unthank have been taken possession of by some sort of great animal, and that it do come here now and then to be fed." "By whom?" Domini inquired patiently. "Why, by Mrs. Unthank." "Mrs. Unthank has not been in this house for many months. From the day she left until last night, so far as I can gather, nothing has been heard of this ghost or beast or whatever it is." "That do seem queer, surely," Middleton admitted. Domini followed the tracks with his eyes to the wood and back again. "Middleton," he said, "I am learning something about spirits. It seems that they not only make tracks, but they require feeding. Perhaps if that is so, they can feel a charge of shot inside them." The old man seemed for a moment to stiffen with slow horror. "You wouldn't shoot at it, Squire?" he gasped. "I should have done so this morning if I had had a chance," Domini replied. "When the weather is a little drier, I am going to make my way into that wood, Middleton, with a rifle under my arm." "Then as God's above, you'll never come out, Squire," was the solemn reply. "We will see," Domini muttered. "I have hacked my way through some queer country in Africa." "There's not like this wood in the world, sir," the old man asserted doggedly. "The bottom's rotten from end to end, and the tops all poisonous. The birds die there on the trees. It's chock full of reptiles and unclean things, with green and purple fungi, 2 feet high, with poison in the very sniff of them. The man who enters that wood goes to his grave." "Nevertheless," Domini said firmly, "within a very short time I am going to solve the mystery of this nocturnal visitor." They returned to the house side by side. Just before they entered, Domini turned to his companion. "Middleton," he said, "you keep up the good old customs, I suppose, and spend half an hour at the Domini Arms now and then?" "Most every night of my life, sir," the old man replied, "from 8 till 9. I'm a man of regular habits, and that do seem right to me that with the work done right and proper, a man should have his relaxation." "That is right, John," Domini assented. "Next time you are there, don't forget to mention that I am going to have that wood looked through. I should like to get it about. You understand?" "That'll fair flummox the folk," was the doubtful reply. "But I'll let 'em know, Squire. There'll be a rare bit of talk, I can promise you that." Domini handed over his gun, went to his room, bathed and changed, and descended for breakfast. There was a sudden hush as he entered, which he very well understood. Everyone began to talk about the prospect of the day's sport. Domini helped himself from the sideboard, and took his place at the table. "I hope," he said, "that our very latest thing in ghosts did not disturb anybody." "We all seem to have heard the same thing," the Cabinet Minister observed with interest. "A most appalling and unearthly cry. I have lately joined every society connected with spooks, and find them a fascinating study." "If you want to investigate," Domini observed as he helped himself to coffee, "you can bring out a revolver and prowl about with me one night. From the time when I was a kid, before I went to Eton, up till when I left here for Africa, we had a series of highly respectable and well-behaved ghosts, who were a credit to the family and of whom we were somewhat proud. This latest spook, however, is something quite outside the pale." "Has he a history?" Mr. Watson asked with interest. "I am informed," Domini replied, "that he is the spirit of a schoolmaster who once lived here, and for whose departure from the world I am supposed to be responsible. Such a spook is neither a credit nor a comfort to the family." Their host spoke with such an absolute absence of emotion that everyone was conscious of a curious reluctance to abandon a subject full of such fascinating possibilities. Terniloff was the only one, however, who made a suggestion. "We might have a battue in the wood," he proposed. "I am not sure," Domini told him, "that the character of the wood is not more interesting than the ghost who is supposed to dwell in it. You remember how terrified the beaters were yesterday at the bare suggestion of entering it? For generations it has been held unclean. It is certainly most unsafe. I went in over my knees on the outskirts of it this morning. Shall we say 10:30 in the gun-room?" Seaman followed his host out of the room. "My friend," he said, "you must not allow these local circumstances to occupy too large a share of your thoughts. It is true that these are the days of your relaxation. Still, there is the Princess for you to think of. After all, she has us in her power. The merest whisper in Downing Street, and behold, catastrophe." Domini took his friend's arm. "Look here, Seaman," he rejoined, "it's easy enough to say there is the Princess to be considered, but will you kindly tell me what on earth more I can do to make her see the position? Necessity demands that I should be on the best of terms with Lady Domini, and I should not make myself in any way conspicuous with the Princess." "I am not sure," Seaman reflected, "that the terms you are on with Lady Domini matter very much to any one. So far as regards the Princess, she is an impulsive and passionate person, but she is also grande dame and a diplomatist. I see no reason why you should not marry her secretly in London, in the name of Everard Dominey, and have the ceremony repeated under your rightful name later on." They had paused to help themselves to cigarettes, which were displayed with a cabinet of cigars on a round table in the hall. Domini waited for a moment before he answered. "Has the Princess confided to you that that is her wish?" he asked. "Something of the sort," Seaman acknowledged. "She wishes the suggestion, however, to come from you." And your advice?"
Seaman blew out a little cloud of cigar smoke.
"My friend," he confessed, "I am a little afraid of the Princess. I ask you no questions as to your own feelings with regard to her. I take it for granted that, as a man of honour, it will be your duty to offer your hand in marriage sooner or later. I see no harm in anticipating a few months, if by that means we can pacify her. Terniloff would arrange it at the Embassy. He is devoted to her, and it will strengthen your position with him." Dominey turned away towards the stairs. "We will discuss this again before we leave," he said gloomily. Dominey was admitted at once by her maid into his wife's sitting room. Rosamund, in a charming morning robe of pale blue lined with grey fur, had just finished breakfast. She held out her hands to him with a delighted little cry of welcome. "How nice of you to come, Everard!" she exclaimed. "I was hoping I should see you for a moment before you went off." He raised her fingers to his lips and sat down by her side. She seemed entirely delighted by his presence, and he felt instinctively that she was quite unaffected by the event of the night before. "You slept well?" he enquired. "Perfectly," she answered. He tackled the subject bravely, as he had made up his mind to on every opportunity. "You do not lie awake thinking of our nocturnal visitor, then?" "Not for one moment. You see," she went on conversationally, "if you were really Everard, then I might be frightened, for some day or other I feel that if Everard comes here, the spirit of Roger Unthank will do him some sort of mischief." "Why?" he asked. "You don't know about these things, of course," she went on. "But Roger Unthank was in love with me, although I had scarcely ever spoken to him before I married Everard. I think I told you that much yesterday, didn't I? After I was married, the poor man nearly went out of his mind. He gave up his work and used to haunt the park here. One evening Everard caught him, and they fought, and Roger Unthank was never seen again. I think that any one around here would tell you," she went on, dropping her voice a little, "that Everard killed Roger and threw him into one of those swampy places near the Black Wood, where a body sinks and nothing is ever seen of it again." "I do not believe he did anything of the sort," Dominey declared. "Oh, I don't know," she replied doubtfully. "Everard had a terrible temper, and that night he came home covered with blood, looking awful. It was the night when I was taken ill." "Well, no more tragedies," he insisted. "I have come up to remind you that we have guests here. When are you coming down to see them?" She laughed like a child. "You say 'we' just as though you were really my husband," she declared. "You must not tell any one of your fantasy," he warned her. She acquiesced at once. "Oh, I quite understand," she assured him. "I shall be very, very careful. And, Everard, you have such clever guests, not at all the sort of people my Everard would have had here, and I have been out of the world for so long that I am afraid I shan't be able to talk to them. Nurse Alice is tremendously impressed. I am sure I should be terrified to sit at the end of the table, and Caroline will hate not being hostess any longer. Let me come down at tea time and after dinner, and slip into things gradually. You can easily say that I am still an invalid, though of course I'm not at all." "You shall do exactly as you choose," he promised, as he took his leave. So when the shooting party tramped into the hall that afternoon, a little weary, but flushed with exercise and the pleasure of the day's sport, they found, seated in a corner of the room, behind the great round table upon which tea was set out, a rather pale but extraordinarily childlike and fascinating woman, with large, sweet eyes which seemed to be begging for their protection and sympathy as she rose hesitatingly to her feet. Dominey was by her side in a moment, and his first few words of introduction brought everyone around her. She said very little, but what she said was delightfully natural and gracious. "It has been so kind of you," she said to Caroline, "to help my husband entertain his guests. I am very much better, but I have been ill for so long that I have forgotten a great many things, and I should be a very poor hostess. But I want to make tea for you, please, and I want you all to tell me how many pheasants you have shot." Terniloff seated himself on the settee by her side. "I am going to help you in this complicated task," he declared. "I am sure those sugar tongs are too heavy for you to wield alone." She laughed at him gaily. "But I am not really delicate at all," she assured him. "I have had a very bad illness, but I am quite strong again." "Then I will find some other excuse for sitting here," he said. "I will tell you all about the high pheasants your husband killed, and about the woodcock he brought down after we had all missed it." "I shall love to hear about that," she assented. "How much sugar, please, and will you pass those hot muffins to the Princess? And please touch that bell. I shall want more hot water. I expect you are all very thirsty. I am so glad to be here with you." End of chapter 19. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 20 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 20. Arm in arm, Prince Terniloff and his host climbed the snow-covered slope at the back of a long fir plantation, towards the little beflagged sticks which indicated their stand. There was not a human being in sight, for the rest of the guns had chosen a steeper, but somewhat less circuitous route. "Von Ragastein," the ambassador said, "I am going to give myself the luxury of calling you by your name. You know my one weakness, a weakness which in my younger days very nearly drove me out of diplomacy. I detest espionage in every shape and form, even where it is necessary. So far as you are concerned, my young friend," he went on, "I think your position ridiculous. I have sent a private dispatch to Potsdam, in which I have expressed that opinion." "So far," Domini remarked, "I have not been overworked." "My dear young friend," the Prince continued, "you have not been overworked, because there has been no legitimate work for you to do. There will be none. There could be no possible advantage accruing from your labours here to compensate for the very bad effect which the discovery of your true name and position would have in the English cabinet." "I must ask you to remember," Domini begged, "that I am here as a blind servant of the Fatherland. I simply obey orders." "I will grant that freely," the Prince consented. "But to continue. I am now at the end of my first year in this country. I feel able to congratulate myself upon a certain measure of success. From that part of the cabinet with whom I have had to do, I have received nothing but encouragement in my efforts to promote a better understanding between our two countries." "The sky certainly seems clear enough just now," agreed Domini. "I have convinced myself," the Prince said emphatically, "that there is a genuine and solid desire for peace with Germany existing in Downing Street. In every argument I have had, in every concession I have asked for, I have been met with a sincere desire to foster the growing friendship between our countries. I am proud of my work here, Von Ragastein. I believe that I have brought Germany and England nearer together than they have been since the days of the Boer War." "You are sure, sir," Domini asked, "that you are not confusing personal popularity with national sentiment?" "I am sure of it," the Ambassador answered gravely. "Such popularity as I may have achieved here has been due to an appreciation of the more healthy state of world politics now existing. It has been my great pleasure to trace the result of my work in a manuscript of memoirs, which some day, when peace is firmly established between our two countries, I shall cause to be published. I have put on record there evidences of the really genuine sentiment in favour of peace which I have found amongst the present cabinet." "I should esteem it an immense privilege," Domini said, "to be given a private reading of these memoirs." "That may be arranged," was the suave reply. "In the meantime, Von Ragastein, I want you to reconsider your position here." "My position is not voluntary," Domini repeated. "I am acting under orders." "Precisely," the other acquiesced. "But matters have changed very much during the last 6 months. Even at the risk of offending France, England is showing wonderful pliability with regard to our claims in Morocco. Every prospect of disagreement between our two countries upon any vital matter has now disappeared. Unless, Domini said thoughtfully, the desire for war should come, not from Downing Street, but from Potsdam. We serve an honourable master, Terniloff declared sternly, and he has shown me his mind. His will is for peace, and for the great triumphs to which our country is already entitled by reason of her supremacy in industry, in commerce, in character, and in genius. These are the weapons which will make Germany the greatest power in the world. No empire has ever hewn its way to permanent glory by the sword alone. We have reached our stations, I see. Come to me after this drive is finished, my host. All that I have said so far has been by way of prelude." The weather had turned drier, the snow was crisp, and a little party of women from the hall reached the guns before the beaters were through the wood. Caroline and Stephanie both took their places by Domini's side. The former, however, after a few minutes passed on to Terniloff's stand. Stephanie and Domini were alone for the first time since their stormy interview in the library. "Has Maurice been talking to you?" she asked a little abruptly. "His Excellency and I are, to tell you the truth," Domini confessed, "in the midst of a most interesting conversation." "Has he spoken to you about me?" "Your name has not yet been mentioned." She made a little grimace. In her wonderful furs and Russian turban hat, she made a rather striking picture against the background of snow. "An interesting conversation in which my name has not been mentioned?" she repeated satirically. "I think you were coming into it before very long," Domini assured her. "His Excellency warned me that all he had said so far was merely the prelude to a matter of larger importance." Stephanie smiled. "Dear Maurice is so diplomatic," she murmured. "I am perfectly certain that he is going to begin by remonstrating you for your shocking treatment of me." Their conversation was interrupted for a few minutes by the sport. Domini called the faithful Middleton to his side for a further supply of cartridges. Stephanie bided her time, which came when the beaters at last emerged from the wood. "Shocking," Stephanie repeated, reverting to their conversation, "is the mildest word in my vocabulary which I can apply to your treatment of me. Honestly, Leopold, I feel bruised all over inside. My pride is humbled." "It is because you look at the matter only from a feminine point of view," Domini persisted. "And you," she answered in a low tone, "once the fondest and the most passionate of lovers, only from a political one. You think a great deal of your country, Leopold. Have I no claims upon you?" "Upon Everard Dominey, none," he insisted. "When the time comes, and Leopold von Ragastein can claim all that is his right, believe me, you will have no cause to complain of coldness or deleteriousness. He will have only one thought, only one hope, to end the torture of these years of separation as speedily as may be." The strained look passed from her face. Her tone became more natural. "But, dear," she pleaded, "there is no need to wait. Your sovereign gives you permission. Your political chief will more than endorse it." "I am on the spot," Domini replied, "and believe me, I know what is safest and best. I cannot live as two men and keep my face steadfast to the world. The Prince, however, has not spoken to me yet. I will hear what he has to say." Stephanie turned a little haughtily away. "You are putting me in the position of a supplicant," she exclaimed. "To-night we must have an understanding." The little party moved on all together to another cover. Rosamund had joined them and hung on to Domini's arm with delight. The brisk walk across the park had brought colour to her cheeks. She walked with all the free and vigorous grace of a healthy woman. Domini found himself watching her, as she deserted him a little later on to stand by Terniloff's side, with a little thrill of tangled emotions. He felt a touch on his arm. Stephanie, who was passing with another of the guns, paused to whisper in his ear. "There might be a greater danger, one that has evaded even your cautious mind, in overplaying your part." Domini was taken possession of by Caroline on their walk to the next stand. She planted herself on a shooting stick by his side and commenced to take him roundly to task. "My dear Everard," she said, "you are one of the most wonderful examples of the reformed rake I ever met. You have even acquired respectability. For heaven's sake, don't disappoint us all." "I seem to be rather good at that," Domini observed, a little drearily. "Well, you are the master of your own actions, are you not?" she asked. "What I want to say in plain words is, don't go and make a fool of yourself with Stephanie." "I have not the least intention of doing anything of the sort." "Well, she has. Mark my words, Everard, I know that woman. She is clever and brilliant, and anything else you like, but for some reason or other she has set her mind upon you. She looks at dear little Rosamund as though she hadn't a right to exist. Don't look so sorry for yourself. You must have encouraged her." Domini was silent. Fortunately, the exigencies of the next few minutes demanded it. His cousin waited patiently until there came a pause in the shooting. "Now, let me hear what you have to say for yourself, sir. So far as I can see, you've been quite sweet to your wife, and she adores you. If you want to have an affair with the Princess, don't begin it here. You'll have your wife ill again if you make her jealous. My dear Caroline, there will be no affair between Stephanie and me. Of that you may rest assured." "You mean to say that this is altogether on her side, then?" Caroline persisted. "You exaggerate her demeanour," he replied. "But even if what you suggest were true—" "Oh, I don't want a lot of protestations," she interrupted. "I am not saying that you encourage her much, because I don't believe you do. All I want to point out is that, having really brought your wife back almost to health, you must be extraordinarily and wonderfully careful. If you want to talk nonsense with Stephanie, do it in Belgrave Square." Domini was watching the gyrations of a falling pheasant. His left hand was stretched out towards the cartridge bag which Caroline was holding. He clasped her fingers for a moment before he helped himself. "You are rather a dear," he said. "I would not do anything to hurt Rosamund for the world." "If you can't get rid of your old tricks altogether, and must flirt," she remarked, "well, I'm always somewhere about. Rosamund wouldn't mind me, because there are a few grey hairs in my sandy ones. And here comes your man across the park. Looks as though he had a message for you. So long as nothing has happened to your cook, I feel that I could face ill tidings with composure." Domini found himself watching with fixed eyes the approach of his rather sad-faced manservant through the snow. Parkins was not dressed for such an enterprise, nor did he seem in any way to relish it. His was the stern march of duty, and curiously enough, Domini felt from the moment he had caught sight of him that he was in some respects a messenger of fate. Yet the message which he delivered, when at last he reached his master's side, was in no way alarming. "A person of the name of Miller has arrived here, sir," he announced, "from Norwich. He is, I understand, a foreigner of some sort, who has recently landed in this country. I found it a little difficult to understand him, but Her Highness's maid conversed with him in German, and I understand that he either is, or brings you a message from a certain Dr. Schmidt, with whom you were acquainted in Africa." The warning whistle blew at that moment, and Domini swung round and stood at attention. His behaviour was perfectly normal. He let a hen pheasant pass over his head, and brought down a cock from very nearly the limit distance. He reloaded before he turned to Parkins. "Is this person in a hurry?" he said. "By no means, sir," the man replied. "I told him that you would not be back until 3 or 4 o'clock, and he is quite content to wait." Domini nodded. "Look after him yourself, then, Parkins," he directed. "We shall not be shooting late to-day. Very likely I will send Mr. Seaman back to talk to him." The man raised his hat respectfully and turned back towards the house. Caroline was watching her companion curiously. "Do you find many of your acquaintances in Africa look you up, Everard?" she asked. "Except for Seaman," Domini replied, looking through the barrels of his gun, "who really does not count because we crossed together, this is my first visitor from the land of fortune. I expect there will be plenty of them by and by, though. Colonials have a wonderful habit of sticking to one another." End of Chapter 20. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 21 of the Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 21. There was nothing in the least alarming about the appearance of Mr. Ludwig Miller. He had been exceedingly well entertained in the butler's private sitting-room, and had the air of having done full justice to the hospitality which had been offered him. He rose to his feet at Dominey's entrance and stood at attention. But for some slight indications of military training, he would have passed anywhere as a highly respectable, retired tradesman. "Sir Everard Dominey?" he inquired. Dominey nodded assent. "That is my name. Have I seen you before?" The man shook his head. "I am a cousin of Dr. Schmidt. I arrived in the colony from Rhodesia after your Excellency had left." "And how is the doctor?" "My cousin is, as always, busy, but in excellent health," was the reply. "He sends his respectful compliments and his good wishes. Also this letter." With a little flourish the man produced an envelope inscribed, "To Sir Everard Dominey, baronet, Domini Hall, in the county of Norfolk, England." Dominey broke the seal just as Seaman entered. "A messenger here from Dr. Schmidt, an acquaintance of mine in East Africa," he announced. "Mr. Seaman came home from South Africa with me," he explained to his visitor. The two men looked steadily into each other's eyes. Dominey watched them, fascinated. Neither betrayed himself by even the fall of an eyelid. Yet Dominey, his perceptive powers at their very keenest in this moment, which instinct told him was one of crisis, felt the unspoken, unbetokened recognition which passed between them. Some commonplace remark was uttered and responded to. Dominey read the few lines which seemed to take him back for a moment to another world. "Honoured and honourable Sir, I send you my heartiest and most respectful greeting. Of the progress of all matters here you will learn from another source. I recommend to your notice and kindness my cousin, the bearer of this letter, Mr. Ludwig Miller. He will lay before you certain circumstances of which it is advisable for you to have knowledge. You may speak freely with him. He is in all respects to be trusted. Signed, Carl Schmidt." "Your cousin is a little mysterious," Dominey remarked, as he passed the letter to Seaman. "Come, what about these circumstances?" Ludwig Miller looked around the little room and then at Seaman. Dominey affected to misunderstand his hesitation. "Our friend here knows everything," he declared. "You can speak to him as to myself." The man began as one who has a story to tell. "My errand here is to warn you," he said, "that the Englishman whom you left for dead at Big Bend, on the banks of the Blue River, has been heard of in another part of Africa." Dominey shook his head incredulously. "I hope you have not come all this way to tell me that. The man was dead." "My cousin himself," Miller continued, "was hard to convince. The man left his encampment with whisky enough to kill him, thirst enough to drink it all, and no food." "So I found him," Dominey assented, "deserted by his boys and raving. To silence him forever was a child's task." "The task, however, was unperformed," the other persisted. "From 3 places in the colony he has been heard of, struggling to make his way to the coast." "Does he call himself by his own name?" Dominey asked. "He does not," Miller admitted. "My cousin, however, desired me to point out to you the fact that in any case he would probably be shy of doing so. He is behaving in an absurd manner. He is in a very weakly state, and without a doubt he is to some degree insane. Nevertheless, the fact remains that he is in the colony, or was 3 months ago, and that if he succeeds in reaching the coast, you may at any time be surprised by a visit from him here. I am sent to warn you in order that you may take whatever steps may be necessary and not be placed at a disadvantage if he should appear." "This is queer news you have brought us, Miller," Seaman said thoughtfully. "It is news which greatly disturbed Dr. Schmidt," the man replied. "He has had the natives up one after another for cross-examination. Nothing can shake their story." "If we believed it," Seaman continued, "this other European, if he had business in this direction, might walk in here at any moment." "It was to warn you of that possibility that I am here." "How much do you know, personally?" Seaman asked. of the existing circumstances?" The man shook his head vaguely. "I know nothing," he admitted. "I went out to East Africa some years ago, and I have been a trader in Mozambique in a small way. I supplied outfits for officers and hospitals and sportsmen. Now and then I have to return to Europe to buy fresh stock. Dr. Schmidt knew that, and he came to see me just before I sailed. He first thought of writing a very long letter. Afterwards he changed his mind. He only wrote these few lines I brought, but he told me those other things." "You have remembered all that he told you?" Domini asked. "I can think of nothing else," was the reply, after a moment's pause. "The whole affair has been a great worry to Dr. Schmidt. There are things connected with it which he has never understood, things connected with it which he has always found mysterious." "Hence your presence here, Johann Wolff?" Seaman asked in an altered tone. The visitor's expression remained unchanged except for the faint surprise which shone out of his blue eyes. "Johann Wolff," he repeated. "That is not my name. I am Ludwig Miller, and I know nothing of this matter beyond what I have told you. I am just a messenger. Once in Vienna, and twice in Krakow, my friend, we have met," Seaman reminded him softly, but very insistently. The other shook his head gently. "A mistake. I have been in Vienna once, many years ago, but Krakow, never." "You have no idea with whom you are talking?" "Herr Seaman was the name I understood." "It is a very good name," Seaman scoffed. "Look here and think." He undid his coat and waistcoat and displayed a plain vest of chamois leather. Attached to the left-hand side of it was a bronze decoration with lettering and a number. Miller stared at it blankly and shook his head. "Information Department, Bureau 12, password 'The day is coming,'" Seaman continued, dropping his voice. His listener shook his head and smiled with the puzzled ignorance of a child. "The gentleman mistakes me for someone else," he replied. "I know nothing of these things." Seaman sat and studied this obstinate visitor for several minutes without speaking, his fingertips pressed together, his eyebrows gently contracted. His vis-à-vis endured this scrutiny without flinching, calm, phlegmatic, the very prototype of the bourgeois German of the tradesman class. "Do you propose," Domini inquired, "to stay in these parts long?" "1 or 2 days. A week, perhaps," was the indifferent answer. "I have a cousin in Norwich who makes toys. I love the English country. I spend my holiday here, perhaps." "Just so," Seaman muttered grimly. "The English country under a foot of snow. So you have nothing more to say to me, Johann Wolff?" "I have executed my mission to His Excellency," was the apologetic reply. "I am sorry to have caused displeasure to you, Herr Seaman." The latter rose to his feet. Domini had already turned towards the door. "You will spend the night here, of course, Mr. Miller?" he invited. "I dare say Mr. Seaman would like to have another talk with you in the morning." "I shall gladly spend the night here, Your Excellency," was the polite reply. "I do not think that I have anything to say, however, which would interest your friend." "You are making a great mistake, Wolff," Seaman declared angrily. "I am your superior in the service, and your attitude towards me is indefensible. If the gentleman would only believe," the culprit begged, "that he is mistaking me for some one else." There was trouble in Seaman's face as the two men made their way to the front of the house, and trouble in his tone as he answered his companion's query. "What do you think of that fellow and his visit?" "I do not know what to think, but there is a great deal that I know," Seaman replied gravely. "The man is a spy, a favourite in the Wilhelmstrasse, and only made use of on important occasions. His name is Wolff, Johann Wolff." "And this story of his?" "You ought to be the best judge of that." "I am," Domini assented confidently. "Without the shadow of a doubt, I threw the body of the man I killed into the Blue River, and watched it sink." "Then the story is a fake," Seaman decided. "For some reason or other, we have come under the suspicion of our own Secret Service." Seaman, as they emerged into the hall, was summoned imperiously to her side by the Princess Eiderstrom. Domini disappeared for a moment and returned presently, having discarded some of his soaked shooting garments. He was followed by his valet, bearing a note upon a silver tray. "From the person in Mr. Parkin's room, to Mr. Seaman, sir," the man announced in a low tone. Dominey took it from the salver with a little nod. Then he turned to where the youngest and most frivolous of his guests were in the act of rising from the tea-table. "A game of pills, Eddy," he proposed. "They tell me that pool is one of your greatest accomplishments." "I'm pretty useful," the young man confessed with a satisfied chuckle. "Give you a black snooker, what?" Dominey took his arm and led him into the billiard-room. "You will give me nothing, young fellow," he replied. "Set them up, and I will show you how I made a living for 2 months at Johannesburg." End of chapter 21. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 22 of The Great Impersonation. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Great Impersonation by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Chapter 22. The evening at Domini Hall was practically a repetition of the previous one, with a different set of guests from the outer world. After dinner, Domini was absent for a few minutes and returned with Rosamund upon his arm. She received the congratulations of her neighbours charmingly, and a little court soon gathered around her. Dr. Harrison, who had been dining, remained upon the outskirts, listening to her light-hearted and at times almost brilliant chatter with grave and watchful interest. Domini, satisfied that she was being entertained, obeyed Terniloff's gestured behest and strolled with him to a distant corner of the hall. "Let me now, my dear host," the Prince began with some eagerness in his tone, "continue and, I trust, conclude the conversation to which all that I said this morning was merely the prelude." "I am entirely at your service," murmured his host. "I have tried to make you understand that from my own point of view, and I am in a position to know something, the fear of war between this country and our own has passed. England is willing to make all reasonable sacrifices to ensure peace. She wants peace. She intends peace. Therefore, there will be peace. Therefore, I maintain, my young friend, it is far better for you to disappear at once from this false position." "I am scarcely my own master," Dominey replied. "You yourself must know that. I am here as a servant under orders." "Join your protests with mine," the Prince suggested. "I will make a report directly I get back to London. To my mind, the matter is urgent. If anything should lead to the discovery of your false position in this country, the friendship between us, which has become a real pleasure to me, must seriously undermine my own position." Dominey had risen to his feet and was standing on the hearthrug in front of a fire of blazing logs. The Ambassador was sitting with crossed legs in a comfortable easy-chair, smoking one of the long, thin cigars which were his particular fancy. "Your Excellency," Dominey said, "there is just one fallacy in all that you have said." "A fallacy?" "You have come to the absolute conclusion," Dominey continued, "that because England wants peace, there will be peace. I am of Seaman's mind. I believe in the ultimate power of the military party of Germany. I believe that in time they will thrust their will upon the Kaiser, if he is not at the present moment secretly in league with them. Therefore, I believe that there will be war." "If I shared that belief with you, my friend," the Ambassador said quietly, "I should consider my position here one of dishonour. My mandate is for peace, and my charge is from the Kaiser's lips." Stephanie, with the air of one a little weary of the conversation, broke away from a distant group and came towards them. Her beautiful eyes seemed tired, she moved listlessly, and she even spoke with less than her usual assurance. "Am I disturbing a serious conversation?" she asked. "Send me away if I am." "His Excellency and I," Dominey observed, "have reached a cul-de-sac in our argument, the blank wall of good-natured but fundamental disagreement." "Then I shall claim you for a while," Stephanie declared, taking Dominey's arm. "Lady Dominey has attracted all the men to her circle, and I am lonely." The Prince bowed. "I deny the cul-de-sac," he said, "but I yield our host. I shall seek my opponent at billiards." He turned away, and Stephanie sank into his vacant place. "So you and my cousin," she remarked as she made room for Dominey to sit by her side, "have come to a disagreement." "Not an unfriendly one," her host assured her. "That I am sure of. Maurice seems, indeed, to have taken a wonderful liking to you. I cannot remember that you ever met before, except for that day or two in Saxony." "That is so. The first time I exchanged any intimate conversation with the Prince was in London. I have the utmost respect and regard for him, but I cannot help feeling that the pleasant intimacy to which he has admitted me is to a large extent owing to the desire of our friends in Berlin. So far as I am concerned, I have never met any one of any nation whose character I admire more." "Maurice lives his life loftily. He is one of the few great aristocrats I have met who carries his nobility of birth into his simplest thought and action. There is just one thing," she added, "which would break his heart." "And that?" "The subject upon which you two disagree. A war between Germany and this country." "The Prince is an idealist," Dominey said. "Sometimes I wonder why he was sent here, why they did not send someone of a more intriguing character." She shrugged her shoulders. "You agree with that great Frenchman," she observed, "that no ambassador can remain a gentleman politically?" "Well, I have never been a diplomat, so I cannot say," Dominey replied. "You have many qualifications, I should think," she observed cuttingly. "Such as?" "You are absolutely callous, absolutely without heart or sympathy where your work is concerned." "I do not admit it," he protested. "I go back to London to morrow," she continued, "a very miserable and unhappy woman. I take with me the letter which should have brought me happiness. The love for which I have sacrificed my life has failed me. Not even the whip of a royal command, not even all that I have to offer, can give me even 5 seconds of happiness." "All that I have pleaded for," Dominey reminded her earnestly, "is delay." "And what delay do you think," she asked, with a sudden note of passion in her tone, "would the Leopold von Ragastein of 6 years ago have pleaded for? Delay? He found words then which would have melted an iceberg. He found words the memory of which comes to me sometimes in the night, and which mock me. He had no country then, save the paradise where lovers walk, no ruler but a queen, and I was she. And now?" Dominey felt a strange pang of distress. She saw the unusual softening in his face, and her eyes lit up. "Just for a moment," she broke off, "you were like Leopold. As a rule, you know, you are not like him. I think that you left him somewhere in Africa and came home in his likeness." "Believe that for a little time," Dominey begged earnestly. "What if it were true?" she asked abruptly. "There are times when I do not recognize you. There are words Leopold used to use which I have never heard from your lips. Is not West Africa the sorcerer's paradise? Perhaps you are an impostor, and the man I love is still there, in trouble, perhaps ill. You play the part of Everard Dominey like a very king of actors. Perhaps before you came here you played the part of Leopold. You are not my Leopold. Love cannot die as you would have me believe." "Now," he said coolly, "you are coming round to my way of thinking. I have been assuring you, from the very first moment we met at the Carlton, that I was not your Leopold, that I was Everard Dominey." "I shall put you to the test," she exclaimed, suddenly rising to her feet. "Your arm, if you please." She led him across the hall to where little groups of people were gossiping, playing bridge, and Seaman, the centre of a little group of gullible amateur speculators, was lecturing on mines. They stopped to say a word or two here and there, but Stephanie's fingers never left her companion's arm. They passed down a corridor hung with a collection of wonderful sporting prints, in which she affected some interest, into a small gallery which led into the ballroom. Here they were alone. She laid her hands upon his shoulders and looked up into his eyes. Her lips drew nearer to his. "Kiss me upon the lips, Leopold," she ordered. "There is no Leopold here," he replied. You yourself have said it." She came a little nearer. "Upon the lips," she whispered. He held her, stooped down, and their lips met. Then she stood apart from him. Her eyes were for a moment closed, her hands were extended as though to prevent any chance of his approaching her again. "Now I know the truth," she muttered. Domini found an opportunity to draw Seaman away from his little group of investment-seeking friends. "My friend," he said, "trouble grows." "Anything more from Schmidt's supposed emissary?" Seaman asked quickly. "No, I am going to keep away from him this evening, and I advise you to do the same. The trouble is with the Princess." "With the Princess," declared Seaman, "I think you have blundered. I quite appreciate your general principles of behaving internally and externally as though you were the person whom you pretend to be. It is the very essence of all successful espionage. But you should know when to make exceptions. I see grave objections myself to your obeying the Kaiser's behest. On the other hand, I see no objection whatever to your treating the Princess in a more human manner, to your visiting her in London, and giving her more ardent proofs of your continued affection. If I once begin—" "Look here," Seaman interrupted. "The Princess is a woman of the world. She knows what she is doing, and there is a definite tie between you. I tell you frankly that I could not bear to see you playing the idiot for a moment with Lady Domini, but with the Princess, scruples don't enter into the question at all. You should by no means make an enemy of her." "Well, I have done it," Domini acknowledged. "She has gone off to bed now, and she is leaving early tomorrow morning. She thinks I have borrowed some West African magic, that I have left her lover's soul out there and come home in his body." "Well, if she does," Seaman declared, "you are out of your troubles." "Am I?" Domini replied gloomily. "First of all, she may do a lot of mischief before she goes. And then, supposing by any 1,000-to-1 chance the story of this cousin of Schmidt's should be true, and she should find Domini out there, still alive. The Princess is not of German birth, you know. She cares nothing for Germany's future. As a matter of fact, I think, like a great many Hungarians, she prefers England. They say that an Englishman has as many lives as a cat. Supposing that chap Domini did come to life again, and she brings him home. You say yourself that you do not mean to make much use of me until after the war has started. In the parlance of this country of idioms, that will rather upset the apple cart, will it not?" "Has the Princess a suite of rooms here?" Seaman inquired. "Over in the West Wing. Good idea. You go and see what you can do with her. She will not think of going to bed at this time of night." Seaman nodded. "Leave it to me," he directed. "You go out and play the host." Domini played the host first, and then the husband. Rosamund welcomed him with a little cry of pleasure. "I have been enjoying myself so much, Everard," she exclaimed. "Everybody has been so kind, and Mr. Mangan has taught me a new patience." "And now I think," Dr. Harrison intervened a little gruffly, "it's time to knock off for the evening." She turned very sweetly to Everard. "Will you take me upstairs?" she begged. "I have been hoping so much that you would come before Dr. Harrison sent me off." "I should have been very disappointed if I had been too late," Domini assured her. "Now, say good night to everybody." "Why, you talk to me as though I were a child," she laughed. "Well, good-bye, everybody, then. You see, my stern husband is taking me off. When are you coming to see me, Dr. Harrison?" "Nothing to see you for," was the gruff reply. "You are as well as any woman here." "Just a little unsympathetic, isn't he?" she complained to Domini. "Please take me through the hall so that I can say good-bye to every one else. Is the Princess Eiderstrom there?" "I am afraid that she has gone to bed," Domini answered as they passed out of the room. "She said something about a headache." "She is very beautiful," Rosamund said wistfully. "I wish she looked as though she liked me a little more. Is she very fond of you, Everard?" "I think that I am rather in her bad books just at present," Domini confessed. "I wonder. I am very observant, and I have seen her looking at you sometimes. Of course," Rosamund went on, "as I am not really your wife, and you are not really my husband, it is very stupid of me to feel jealous, isn't it, Everard?"
"Not a bit," he answered. "If I am not your husband, I will not be any one else's." "I love you to say that," she admitted with a little sigh, "but it seems wrong somewhere. Look how cross the Duchess looks. Some one must have played the wrong card." Rosamund's farewells were not easily made. Terniloff especially seemed reluctant to let her go. She excused herself gracefully, however, promising to sit up a little later the next evening. Domini led the way upstairs, curiously gratified at her lingering progress. He took her to the door of her room and looked in. The nurse was sitting in an easy-chair reading, and the maid was sewing in the background. "Well, you look very comfortable here," he declared cheerfully. "Pray do not move, nurse." Rosamund held his hands, as though reluctant to let him go. Then she drew his face down and kissed him. "Yes," she said a little plaintively, "it's very comfortable, Everard." "Yes, dear?" She drew his head down and whispered in his ear. "May I come in and say good night for 2 minutes?" He smiled, a wonderfully kind smile, but shook his head. "Not to-night, dear," he replied. "The Prince loves to sit up late, and I shall be downstairs with him. Besides, that bully of a doctor of yours insists upon 10 hours' sleep." She sighed like a disappointed child. "Very well." She paused for a moment to listen. "Wasn't that a car?" she asked. "Some of our guests going away early, I dare say," he replied as he turned away. Chapter 22. Recording by Tom Weiss.